Oh, for sure. Yeah, like 100%. Because all of the conflicts that people have, that all of, that all queer people have, the conflicts in reconciling your life, your normal life, versus the life that you were told is not normal, but that you really want to live and feel compelled to live, for me happened in a hotbed of heteronormative toxic male uh, you know psyche. Like, so it was kind of like, it couldn't have been a more safe environment to me in terms of my personal history as a member of a family that kind of built this thing. But it couldn't have been more terrifying in terms of my, at that time, secret queerness. I'm Tommy Smythe. Uh, some people within the context of hockey would recognize that surname. But I myself am not associated with hockey, certainly the business of hockey at all, though people in previous generations in my family were. What I do is I live, I work as an interior designer, and I have a media presence in lifestyle television. So I have been in the media in Canada and the United States, a little bit abroad in many countries around the world as an out gay person since roughly 2001 in terms of my career on television. So it's been about 20 years of being out and gay on TV. And it's been a lifetime of being a person from a very well-known hockey family.
A well-known hockey family, also being in Toronto,
Yeah.
a part of an extremely well-known hockey family here is like
Mhm.
a big deal. So, how did you get into hockey? Because you were in it for a little bit.
When I was a kid, I played in hockey. I played hockey as a, like, probably between the ages of about 6 and 10. Um, and it was not something that I wanted to do at all. In fact, I was quite vocally against it for basically since the get-go. Um, and it was something that was really insisted upon in our household for a period of time until my parents sort of came around to it. I think it was more for us, I think for the kids in my family, my cousins and myself, some of whom really embraced hockey as players and participants in that recreational activity. Um, some of whom didn't. So some did and some didn't, and I was one who didn't. I remember I have like vivid memories of being like very young and having to put on, the shin pads and the socks and get kind of like ready in the house before getting driven over to the rink, super early in the morning, like before the sun came up. And I remember having this sense that like my mom, who was getting me suited up, didn't really enjoy it very much either. But then, so I came out of it with this sort of like very, as a young kid, I was a pretty thoughtful young kid. And I remember even at the time thinking to myself, like, why are we doing this? Like, nobody is enjoying this at all. And yet we're all still doing it. Like, she's pissed, I'm cranky, I'm terrified, I don't want to go. It's interesting, as an adult, you think a little bit about like trying to recall those feelings that were associated with the practice, like with the actual hockey practice. For me, it was mostly fear. I think I even at that young age, I felt a certain amount of pressure that I would be good at hockey because of my surname. And, I wasn't, or that I remember going in and thinking like, I don't even know the rules. And so, but I was sort of like thrust into it. And I was just kind of like, even as a kid, expected to know everything about hockey. So I was afraid to ask questions because if I asked a question, it would be like, I was worried about facing ridicule that I wouldn't know, like what happens if you go over the blue line, and like there were all kinds of like things that I had anxiety about as a child, being thrust into this environment, being literally thrown onto the rink against my will, and then really getting there and not being empowered because of all this pressure to even learn as much as I could have maybe.
It sounds like you had a tumultuous relationship with hockey.
Yeah, I did.
Did you ever love it, or was it always like? Did you ever have a good relationship with it, like, or was it always kind of like that?
That's an awesome question. I did later really enjoy going to games with my late father when I was in my teens. So my dad, whose name was also Tom, um, he had a career in real estate, but he always maintained a lease on the sporting goods store in Maple Leaf Gardens, which was called, I don't know if you remember it, but it was called Doug Lurie Sports. And Doug Lurie Sports was a family hobby business almost for us. So my sister and I and many of my high school friends worked in the store on game nights and on weekends as part-time jobs. And so during those years that we were doing that, I had a great relationship with hockey. Like I loved going into the games. I would go in with my dad during the periods, and in the intermissions, go back to the store. We would all work the store. It was crazy packed with people, like being on a crowded bus at rush hour. It was actually that busy. We had to have a person on the door to let certain people in and out as the numbers were increasing during the intermission periods. So, that part of it was great. It was cool to have a job at that age. It was a building and a staff within a building that was really familiar to me. I knew all the people that worked in Maple Leaf Gardens because I kind of grew up there.
It's really interesting to me because throughout these interviews, so many people have spoken about one of the things they loved or most loved was communities they've built.
Yeah.
And it seems like you had a community you had built with your friends working, also the bond with your father to go into the game and that connection, right?
Yeah.
Um, that said, how could hockey be better for you and for the queer community?
I mean, gosh, that's such a big question, Brock. Like it's a lot, I understand why you're asking it in these interviews because many voices sometimes, contributing to the answer to a question like that can get us closer to, a truth or an answer. But it's a tough thing for me because I was still, even at that time, my queerness and my hockey life really only converged in an almost secret way. So I can say, when I was working at Doug Laurie Sports in high school, um, and for a little while post high school, I was not out of the closet to my family, but I was to my friend Rebecca, who worked in the store with me. And we used to, when I was, in my late teens and early 20s, we would go out to the gay clubs in Toronto, to like Chaps and Colby's and like a bunch of the old gay bars and nightclubs. She and I and a handful of my other friends, we would go out until like 3 o'clock in the morning, and then we would tell our parents that we were sleeping at each other's houses, but we would actually let ourselves in because I had keys to the store, and we would go down into the basement of Doug Lurie Sports and make beds for ourselves out of the inventory of hockey jerseys. There was a bathroom down there, and then we would wake up on Saturday morning and sort of clean ourselves up and open up the store to customers and then work there for the entire day. And that
That
was,
it
so I had these two lives. I had, like, I was going to hockey games with my dad, and working at the store on game nights, but then on Saturday nights, after the game, we would go out and then, sometimes sleep overnight in the basement.
and for those who don't know, the old Maple Leaf Gardens was located basically adjacent or almost in the gay village.
It was
Um,
literally in the gay village. Like, like all the drag queens and the go-go dancers and the bartenders from the clubs would go to the Golden Griddle, the pancake house across the street from Maple Leaf Gardens, after the clubs. And so sometimes Rebecca and I would do that. And then we would just kind of like scuttle across the street, unlock the door, lock it back up again, and sneak down into the basement to sleep.
that's such
Convenient.
an incredible, like, who can say that they had keys to Maple Leaf Gardens
Yeah,
and would go to queer spaces
I
and
know.
then come back and crash in like one of the most historical buildings to ever exist?
It's kind of like when I think back to it, and we just did it because we were stupid kids. But when I think about it, because the keys, of course, you could get into the rest of the building. Rebecca and I never did. There was security in the building, um, and the security knew us. So I mean, we could have, but why would we? Like, there was no reason to do that. But I also remember, like, I remember being in my late teens, and one of the guys that worked for my father managing the store was also really great friends with all of the players, and then some of the players were friends with us too, and we knew them a little bit. And so sometimes I'd have to go and get him, um, to come back to the store for a phone call or something like that in the locker room. And so I'd go in, and there was Stan, who was the gatekeeper, who knew me and would let me into the building off hours. And you'd go into the Leafs dressing room, where they had the slogan on the beam across the top that my great grandfather put there, which I think said, I'm paraphrasing, but I think it said, "Defeat does not rest lightly on their shoulders." Um, but then there were these like incredibly beautiful men, naked, and I would just be like, not no, I wouldn't know where to look, like, because you, as a young queer kid, you like, imagine if you said to like any young queer kid, like, I could get you into the Leafs, dressing room, and you'd just be like, no, that's like a porn fantasy, like, which it actually was, of course. Like, I mean, you were a player yourself. You know that these are young men at the peak of their athletic power. Their bodies are never going to be better than they are then. And, like, so for me, it was like a hormonal, like, catastrophic hormonal confusion of, like, wanting to be there and not wanting to be there, and being, drawn to it, but also being like terrified of it. Like, there's a lot, for me, there was like a lot of that kind of emotion in it too. But it was also like, it's also kind of like being in, in your grandfather's house, and thinking about something dirty, because this was a place that since infancy, was a very familiar building and a familiar place to me, with a lot of emotion tied up in it. um, and a lot of, like, let's be honest, like, a lot of really major, like, male, heteronormative masculine toxicity, and like all those other things that are just kind of like in the air around there, and in the language of like the fans, as they would be coming and going from the games, you would overhear things. It was a very, like, it's a pretty, like, psychically complex place for me.
It almost sounds like you discovered part of your gayness in Maple Leaf Gardens. Is that fair?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, like 100%. Because all of the conflicts that people have, that all of, that all queer people have, the conflicts in reconciling your life, your normal life, versus the life that you were told is not normal, but that you really want to live and feel compelled to live, for me, happened in a hotbed of, heteronormative toxic male, uh, you know psyche. Like, so it was kind of like, it couldn't have been a more safe environment to me in terms of my personal history as a member of a family that kind of built this thing. But it couldn't have been more terrifying in terms of my, at that time, secret queerness. So yeah,
So
that's
fascinating.
fucked up shit, really. Like, this is great therapy.
It's fucked up but fascinating. Like I'm
If
fascinated by all of this.
you sent me a bill for $10,000 after this Zoom call, I probably would pay it.
Okay, I'm sending that bill.
Therapy. Isn't that what therapy costs? I don't know. Probably. I'm sure I've spent that much on
Um,
therapy.
we'll say it's 10,000 just because I want to collect. Um, do you have a relationship with hockey now?
Uh, well, that's a complicated question too. Like, for me, yes and no. So I am the chairperson of the board of directors of the Smythe Foundation. a lot of people think that when my great grandfather Conn Smythe died, that there was a lot of money inherited by his family. It actually all went to a charitable foundation, all of his money. And to this day, several members of the family and then invited board members, in addition to family members, run the foundation and give away that money to charities that we feel were aligned with what he wanted to support in life, and that also incorporate some more contemporary and relevant causes and organizations now. So, my relationship with hockey, the biggest relationship I have with hockey now is spending money that hockey made to give to, worthwhile organizations. That's the closest relationship I have. My sister and I co-own 3 sets of season tickets to the games, because I'm sure you're probably aware that you can inherit those. They're able to be passed down in estates. So my great grandfather's seats, my grandfather's seats, and my late father's seats all belong to us. And those are basically, at this time, they're just basically sold at cost to friends. And my sister and my brother-in-law keep a set for themselves that they use. And I sometimes will buy some of the tickets to give to friends and colleagues of mine. Like, I have a friend who works at the pub next door to where I live, who is from Edmonton, and she's a huge Oilers fan. So if there's a Toronto Oilers game, a Toronto Edmonton game, I usually give her those tickets. So it's, so the relationship is distant. My career is really distant from that life and from the legacy of my family. Which is not to say that I don't appreciate the legacy of my family. I think that there were a lot of things that we learned in our household growing up that were different than would be learned in some households, based on the history of sports and of the business of sports and of the living of public lives that our family brought literally not just to the table, like to the dinner table, to the Thanksgiving table. So, we were very fortunate that we grew up in an environment where, competition and sports and sportsmanlike conduct were encouraged and taught. We were brought up in a family where it was explained to us from a very early age that you don't get to enjoy the privileges that you have without returning those gifts to the community that you live within. So those are things, interestingly, that came from hockey and from my family's life in that business and their charitable pursuits, that the money that they made in the hockey business afforded them an opportunity to do, that I applied directly to my life as a queer person and the community, in the queer community within which I live now. Yeah.
Speaking of the queer community, I mean, you've lived in these hypermasculine spaces, you've lived in queer spaces, and you've seen the evolution of queerness in society.
Yeah.
Is there anything that gives you hope that we'll see an evolution in hockey culture or sport culture the same way we have in society as a whole?
I do think that, and the only reason I think that, it's not really necessarily that it's my opinion that will happen, because I don't think these are opinion-based conversations. But if we look at the data and we look at the facts and we look at the history of social change, it really is, it comes much more slowly to institutions and systems than it does to the general culture. So if there's a general cultural shift, generally the last systems or organizations to adopt those cultural changes are the military and the world of professional sports. And the world of professional sports sets the standard that trickles down all the way to what we were talking about earlier, when I was in these very young organized, like when I was a kid playing hockey.
Yeah, like minor hockey, youth sport.
Minor hockey and youth sport. So those, there's always like a slow to the party, a slow arrival for the military and for sports with all things that are culturally accepted elsewhere. And I don't know why that is, but I definitely know that that is a fact. So yes, the answer to the question is I do assume and expect that places like the NHL will eventually catch up. They usually do. It just takes decades longer than it does for the rest of us to do it. Even though those organizations, bafflingly, are comprised of people from greater society. Even we have I think an ability or a tendency as human beings to compartmentalize things, where it's sort of like, like, oh, my gay cousin is an awesome guy and we had a great time at the family reunion and at Thanksgiving dinner, and he's great. Would I want him to play on my hockey team? Definitely not, because the other guys wouldn't accept that. But that's not me, that's the other guys. So I accept it because of the other guys. There's like that whole, give ourselves these rationalizations for exclusion. And I think that's what makes those systems and those institutions slower to arrive than the rest of society as a whole, because the permissions aren't there. They're not giving themselves or each other the permission to be as accepting as they could be or should be. Definitely should be is the correct way to say it, because it's just, we're just people. We're not that threatening. Although I was looking at everyone's wiener when I was in the Leafs dressing room, so. Guys, sorry.
Oh, Tommy.
Enough it.
Enough
it.
Is there anything else you'd like to add, or any fun story you can give us from beyond checking out wieners and sleeping in the basement of Maple Leaf Gardens?
I don't know. Like, it's funny. I think, when you look at any institution that feels impenetrable, like a citadel of sorts, where it's like, impossible for, there to be complete transparency or access. And there's this guarded nature to it. I think that those things, I think it's very interesting if you look at, like, Smythe, for instance, was a man who was renowned for his contribution to the world of hockey in general, but also had this massive association with the military and a very storied career in the military. He served in both world wars, was a highly decorated military official, had many, his biography that was published just before he died, or actually just after he died, I think it was 1981. He, lived in both of these worlds of this, like, toxic masculinity, this hyper masculine worlds, and also seemed to really navigate them quite brilliantly and successfully. And I think there's a connection there somehow to, like, the way that hockey was established as an institution, not just as a game. We have to look at both things. One is a game, and a game should be available for everyone to play. But then there's this institution, and I think the institution is basically, it occurs because everyone seems to have built these, fortresses around it. They're protecting it in some way from a perceived threat that may or may not even exist. So you have a lot of, like, there was an interesting thing that came up recently about Con, and I was asked to comment on it by a journalist, and he had uncovered in somebody's biography that my great-grandfather may have been overheard in a conversation making an off-color joke about a Black player in the 1940s or 50s. And the comment that he was alleged to have made was, I'll give $10,000 to any man who can change that man's skin color from black to white. And I don't know if he said it. I would never, hearken an opinion about whether he would have said that or not, because I wasn't there. And the person who was claiming that he did say it also wasn't there. And the person who said that he overheard it was not a part of the conversation. However, what I think is really interesting about it is that, like a lot of things that have to do with gay culture, a lot of things that have to do with racism are contextualized in the past and are, very relevant in the present. So we look at this thing of cancel culture, like Conn Smythe should be canceled. This journalist was saying they should take his name off of the MVP trophy because of this comment that may or may not have been said in so long ago. So cancel culture is very confusing. It's out of control. You can't have said anything ever, living or dead. And a lot of that I understand because, the hurt that comes from those kinds of things is multi-generational. The hurt doesn't go away. We have all heard about this, aspect of that kind of pain that actually becomes a genetic aspect of the genetic makeup of future generations. However, you know, I was asked to comment on this, and I was like, I can't think of a person, you know, less relevant to comment on that than I. I am a person who lives in the world of interior design. I share a surname with this person who may or not have said this thing in the past. I only knew him until I was 10 years old, which was the point at which he died. I never was able to sit down and have a conversation with him about race or his thoughts about, Black or brown people, or, Black players playing in the NHL. I was never able to have that conversation with him. I would love to if I could now, because I think it would be for him probably a really challenging conversation, and for me something that I feel is really relevant. But it's there are aspects of that kind of culture, racism and toxic masculinity and hypermasculinity within sports, that carry a lot of pain through a lot of decades of years. And I think that we have to keep talking about those things. And I love what you're doing here, because I think it opens up a space for people to talk about uncomfortable things. You and I have been friends, like personal friends. So, from private conversations with me that I don't have any filter when it comes to talking about these things. Like I'm sure there are members of my family who are in older generations who would be like, I can't believe you talked about the changing of the skin color comment. But I think we should talk about it, because, even if he did say it, why would he have said it, do you think?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
I think some of it lends back to the concept you had of having that gay cousin, and but it's not accepted yet by the peers, so therefore you're not going to necessarily accept it, but it's on them.
That's what and my opinion about that is, first and foremost, Con was a hockey man. He was a hockey person. He loved the game. He loved to win. It's probably one of the reasons that the team doesn't win as much as it used to, because there haven't been hockey people in charge of the team for a really long time. There's been a lot of business people who like hockey but also are in it for the revenue. But Con was also a businessman, and he would have known at the time that even if he thought, fuck it, I don't care what this guy looks like or who he is, he's a great player. But he knew that if he put him on the ice, there might be subscribers and ticket buyers who would not go to the games, because at that time, that was a reality of being a Black human being in this country. We don't like to talk about it, but it is so. And so it may have been more of a business decision, but it wasn't a very humane, like, though the change happens through risk. And like, if he had really been a little more interesting in terms of his approach to that conundrum, he might have said, fuck it, I'm just going to put him out there and see what happens, and then decide later. But I guess that didn't happen. I don't know, but it's an interesting thing because it came up not too long ago. I mean, it was just during the recent sort of more flare up of the BLM movement, which we all, I think, learned a great deal from. I know I did. This was something that came up and came across my computer screen, and I thought, I can't comment on that. I can comment on that as a human being, but not as a hockey professional or as a player or as a person who exists within that world anymore. I exist with some of the trauma from being in it as a kid. And, I live my life with the surname that I have, so that sometimes when I go through customs, people are like, hey, wait a minute, are you? And I'm like, yes, I am on HGTV. And then they say, oh, no, I was going to say, are you related to Con Smythe? I'm like, super like, okay, what? Okay, yes, I am also that. Yeah. So.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think it's important dialogue and conversation, and it's something that we have to, especially we're seeing right now in Canada, we have to look at the past and generational
Yeah.
trauma, and how do we evolve things, and how do we make it better for now and future, which is ultimately part of the goal of this, right? Is how do we make this better for queer folks?
Well, and that's why I brought up, race in the context of queerness, because, it's also that, like hockey could be a lot more inclusive in that department as well. Um, and those opportunities that only exist to certain, so people within certain socioeconomic strata. I see a lot of change, and I hear about a lot of change in those zones as well. So, for queer people to find safe space within hockey, for people of color to find safe space within hockey, like maybe they could look to us for a little advice on that too. But because, like we tend to, as queer people, have an easier time relating to people who are marginalized racially. And so, if we could all be there together, it would be really nice too.
Yeah,
But
completely. Or they can, finally bring in, BIPOC communities, leaders who are in hockey, and let them make it safe for them, because that's not happening. So,
no, and
um,
and it should, and it, like I said, I believe it will, and I think that what you're doing here can be a step toward that for sure. It's all about listening and talking, and I do a lot more. I try to do a lot more listening than I do talking, but I've never given an interview like this. I've never been asked. So good on you.